The docking arm shuddered when the second ship latched on, and Tomek grabbed the nearest handhold out of reflex, his satchel swinging wide and scattering 3 pencils across the corridor floor. He did not retrieve them immediately. He was watching. The Vareth colony station smelled of copper and old rain. That was Tomek's translation, his best attempt at converting a pheromone gradient that was, technically, a sentence. He had been on the station for 11 minutes, and already his nose had stopped trying to parse it into anything human. The smell simply was. It pressed against the inside of his skull like a hand held flat against a window. The corridor beyond the airlock was full of Vareth, and they had all gone still. Not frozen, not the stillness of fear, though Tomek's nervous system was insisting that it was. They breathed. Their secondary gland frills, the small chemosensory organs that lined the ridge of the jaw, cycled in slow, rhythmic pulses, tasting the air. But no one moved. 200 bodies, give or take, arranged across 3 levels of the arrival hall, and not one of them was walking. Not one was speaking in the short-range pressure wave clicks that passed for casual Vareth speech. They were aimed at the second ship. Tomek retrieved his pencils. He opened his sketchbook to a fresh page. He drew the shape of the silence, which is the only thing you can do with a silence that has a shape. The princess emerged from the docking arm 9 minutes later. He would not have known her as royalty from appearance. Vareth physical distinction was subtle, a matter of gland development and carriage that his human eyes were not trained to read. What he registered was posture, the particular way her body moved through a room as if the room had been expecting her. She was taller than average, her 4-fingered hands loose at her sides, her gland frills cycling faster than anyone else's. She wore nothing that Tomek would have called insignia. The colony breathed her in. Savith of the third emanation had been away for 4 years, which was long enough in Vareth biological accounting to begin to become a kind of ghost. The colony memory worked chemically. Sense signatures were maintained by proximity and reinforcement. Absence let them fade from the walls, from the communal air, from the shared archive that was not stored in any server but in the gland tissue of every living Vareth in the station. She had faded. She had not vanished, not yet, but she had faded, which was something the colony's more conservative factions had been counting on. Savith did not look at the crowd. She looked briefly at Tomek. He was the only creature in the room that was moving, drawing, specifically, with the focused animal absorption of a person who cannot help themselves, his pencil scratching across vellum in small, deliberate arcs. He smelled, to her extraordinarily precise chemosensory apparatus, of iron and anxiety, and something she did not have a category for yet, a warm-blooded deliberateness, a quality of sustained attention that her species performed only through chemical broadcast, never through this strange, voluntary muscular stillness. He was not still because he was calm. He was still because he was concentrating. She filed this away, the creature that smells of iron and memory. Then she walked past him into the station, and the colony exhaled and began, carefully, uncertainly, like a language half-remembered, to relearn her. The archive chambers ran along the station's innermost ring, away from the docking arms and the hydroponic bays and the noise of a working colony. Tomek had been assigned access as part of the diplomatic archaeography brief. Document, analyze, do not touch anything you cannot put back. He touched everything carefully and put it all back. The Vareth kept their records in stone. Not metaphorically. The archive walls were a particular porous basalt, imported at considerable expense from the species' home system, and into this stone the Vareth pressed their gland secretions the way a human might press a seal into wax, except the wax was geological, and the seal was the full chemical complexity of a lived moment. Grief, authority, the specific texture of a decision made under pressure, the sense signature of every individual present when the record was made. An archaeographer who was also a chemist could, theoretically, reconstruct the emotional weather of any decision in the colony's history. Tomek was not a chemist. He was an archaeographer, which meant he was trained to see the shape of things he could not fully read. He pressed his fingers to a record near the archive's oldest section. His fingers came away smelling of something he did not have words for. Not grief exactly, more like the smell of a room where something important had recently been moved. He drew the wall instead in cross-section. The layering of secretions, the relative depth, the way certain records had been pressed over others as if the colony were annotating its own past. He did not know what any of it said. He drew it anyway. He was doing this when he became aware that someone was watching him. He turned. Savith stood at the archive entrance, 4 meters away, her gland frills still, her attention on him with a quality that Tomek was already learning to recognize as the Varith equivalent of a very long, very quiet look. "I'm archaeographing," he said, which was not a verb in any language but his own personal usage, and she did not speak his language, so the words were for himself. "I'm documenting this. I think it's important." She did not respond. She looked at his sketchbook. He held it out, which was either polite or alarming. She took it, which he filed away as possibly neither. She turned the pages. He watched her gland frills move through patterns he could not parse, tasting the paper, he realized, tasting the graphite, tasting the accumulated oils of his hands on every page he had turned. She reached the drawing he had made that morning, without understanding what he was seeing. The reckoner's apparatus, set up in a secondary chamber off the main archive. He had drawn it in full cross-section, the way he drew everything, as if it were a mechanism with a purpose that could be understood if you simply looked at it long enough and from the right angle. The reckoners were the colony's memory managers, the caste responsible for the maintenance and formal dissolution of scent records. The apparatus, Tomek had thought, looked like a very precise kind of erasing machine. He had not known whose record it was set up to erase. Savith looked at the drawing for a long time. He watched her understand that he had understood, in whatever limited way he was capable of, that something was being taken away. A creature with no glands, no chemosensory apparatus. No way to read the chemical record of 4 years of deliberate political patience. This creature had looked at the machine and drawn it as if it were ancient, as if it were important, as if it were the kind of thing that ought to be witnessed and kept. She did not have a word for what he had done. She created one, silently, in the grammar of her own cognition, the act of a witnessing creature that preserves things it cannot smell. She would need the word later. She handed the sketchbook back. Her gland frills cycled in a pattern Tomek would not be able to translate for another 6 months, when he finally had enough of the language to attempt the chemical grammar. When he did translate it, working from the impressions he had made in his own notes, a slow ripple, outward from the jaw ridge, something like water finding new ground. The closest approximation he could manage was, "I had not considered that you might keep faith with a thing you cannot understand." He drew her expression instead, which was not a Varith expression exactly, but was the nearest his human face-reading apparatus could get to whatever was happening in her gland frills. He labeled it, in his cramped field notation, the first thing we both understood. The reckoner ceremony was held at the end of the station cycle, in the great interior chamber where the archive walls curved together at the colony's gravitational center. Every Varith on the station was present in some capacity, physically, if their caste permitted it, chemically, through the broadcast relays that carried the scent record of significant events to those who could not attend. The air was layered with meaning Tomek could not read, heavy with the accumulated attention of a community that was about to do something formally irreversible. He stood at the back, which was permitted. He had his sketchbook. The apparatus was assembled at the center of the chamber. The chief reckoner, a figure of considerable biological authority whose gland frills were permanently dilated with something that smelled to Tomek like old decisions, moved through the preparation ritual with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. The process of formal unscenting was not cruel. It was simply thorough. Savith's scent signature would be drawn from the station's chemical memory, record by record, beginning with the most recent and moving backward. The colony's way of politely pretending a person had simply not returned, rather than announcing that they were choosing to make it so. Savith stood at the center of the chamber, and she was composed in a way that Tomek recognized as costing something. Her frills were cycling steadily. She was broadcasting calm into a room that wanted to panic. That was what the Queen Cast did. That was what she was biologically, a creature whose chemistry soothed the colony's fear response, whose presence in a room made collective decision-making possible. The Reckoners had timed this carefully. She had been back long enough to remind the colony that she existed, and not long enough to re-establish the full depth of her signature in the walls. The erasure, done now, would be thorough. Tomek looked at his sketchbook. He looked at the archive wall to his left, where the oldest records in the colony's memory were pressed so deep into the basalt that they had become part of the stone structure. Decisions made before the station existed, carried here from the home system, the chemical memory of the Varith people stretching back further than any human archive he had ever touched. He took out a sheet of archival vellum. He had brought several, folded into his satchel, because archival vellum was what you used when you wanted something to last. He took out the drawing he had made of Savith in the archive chamber, the one he had labeled in his cramped notation, the first thing we both understood. He took out a second drawing, the colony's arrival hall, the silence that had a shape, her figure moving through a room that had been expecting her. He walked to the oldest section of the archive wall. The reckoner near the apparatus noticed. Two others noticed. The whole chamber, in its chemical way, noticed Tomek's iron and anxiety scent moving against the formal current of the ceremony, a warm-blooded shape doing something that did not fit any category of permitted or forbidden, because no category had been made for it. He pressed the vellum sheets against the porous basalt. He did not have glands. He did not have secretions. He pressed them flat with the back of his hand, the way you might press a letter against a wall, hoping the wall could read. He pushed a small amount of archival adhesive along the edges. He had brought that too, because he had learned, in 11 years of field archaeology, that you bring what you need to keep things in place. And he smoothed the drawings into the stone beside the oldest record in the colony's memory. He stepped back. The chamber was very quiet. He could not explain in their language what he had done or why. He did not have the chemical grammar for it. He had a human grammar instead, which was made of stories told about strangers and actions taken on behalf of people you had known for 4 days and things drawn in sketchbooks because you could not stop yourself from witnessing. He had pressed a piece of human memory into a Varith wall. It would not smell of anything they could read. It would smell of graphite and vellum and the oils of his hands. It would be there. Savith looked at the drawings on the wall. The chamber looked at Savith. The chief reckoner's frills moved through a pattern Tomek would later learn was used only in situations for which no precedent existed. Then Savith spoke. She spoke in the formal chemical register, the Queen Cast's biological authority behind every gland pulse, the full depth of a signature that had been rebuilding itself in the station's walls for 4 days and was not, it turned out, as faded as the reckoners had calculated. She spoke to the colony's chemical memory, which was also the colony's social logic, which was also the colony's fear, and she reminded it what she was. The reckoner apparatus was not activated that day. Years passed. The station grew. The diplomatic brief became a permanent post, and then a small human enclave, and then something that did not have a name yet in either language, but that both species navigated with the particular care you give to something you do not want to break. Tomek's drawings remained in the archive wall, pressed into the oldest basalt of the colony's memory, slowly acquiring a patina of accumulated chemical attention. Every Varith who passed that section of the wall pausing to taste the strange, scentless records, learning them the way you learn a word in a foreign language, imperfectly, and with the understanding that imperfect is not the same as wrong. The colony's young learned to read them as a glyph. The glyph did not have a perfect translation. It meant something in the neighborhood of a creature that could not smell, that had no glands, that had no biological stake in the outcome, had pressed a record into the wall anyway. It meant witnessed. It meant kept faith with a thing it could not understand. A child on a school visit to the archive pressed the tip of a developing gland frill against the corner of the vellum. The gland frill was not yet mature enough to broadcast. It was still learning to receive. The child tasted graphite and paper and the faint, fatting trace of a human hand. The child filed it away, creating a new category in the grammar of its growing cognition, a category that would take years to name and that would never translate perfectly into any other language. The nearest approximation, arrived at by a Varith linguist 3 generations later, working from the chemical record of that school visit, the specific quality of attention paid by a mind that has no reason to remember and remembers anyway. The vellum was still there, the graphite lines were still clear,